Welcome to Kingston WritersFest, the last day of the 2020 online edition. My name is Barbara Bell, and I'm really pleased to present the opposite of identical fiction. I'd like to begin this session by acknowledging that the land on which the staff and board worked to get this festival ready and from which we are generating this online presentation today is the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples. We gratefully acknowledge these Indigenous nations for their historical and ongoing guardianship of this land. We agree to peaceably share in responsibility for stewardship of this land, its waters, and all of its biodiversity. All of those who come to live and work here are responsible for honoring these relationships in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. Some thank yous. We're so grateful to the organizations and individuals who support the festival. In particular, Kingston WritersFest would like to thank author patrons Tim and Christine Everdell of Quarry Pharmacy. They are author patrons today of Annabelle Lyon. Canada Council, Heritage Canada, Ontario Arts Council, the City of Kingston, and Kingston Arts Council. Special thanks, of course, to Tourism Kingston for their marketing support, and thank you to all those of you who have donated to or supported the festival. Just a little bit of housekeeping. So the event is 45 minutes long, and it will include a brief question and answer period. Be sure to tell us where you're calling in from or joining us from using the Zoom Q&A function, which you'll find at the bottom of the platform screen. And you can post your questions for Annabelle there too. Complete our online survey for the chance to win a pass to next year's festival or a basket of books. Check our website for details. And we do hope you'll stick around for our closing event, In Praise of Paths, featuring Norwegian author Torbjorn Eklund, joining us from Norway at 3:30 p.m. Eastern Time. And now to the main event. I will introduce our interviewer, Tricia Knowles, and then I'm going to turn things over to her. Tricia Knowles is a cultural curator, festival and event producer, and arts promoter. A passionate reader, Tricia has been part of the WritersFest team for many years, including the last 5 as marketing director. She's one of the founding members and artistic director of Calliope Collective, which presents several annual festivals that are committed to creative placemaking and a cultivation of a sense of wonder. Committed to the environment as well as the arts, Tricia founded and developed Kingston Unplugged, a local environmental music and arts event in support of the World Wildlife Fund's Earth Hour initiative. This project ran for 10 years. Tricia believes that festivals improve the quality of life for the city's residents, and this led her to obtain a certificate in cultural planning and development from University of British Columbia. She is also a stilt walker, body painter, and a lover of all things circus. Please welcome Tricia Knowles.
That I am. Thank you so much, Barbara. A pleasure to be on this side of the festival this year. It's been such a whirlwind and such an honor to be a part of this festival for the last decade. I'm so honored and pleased to introduce to you this afternoon to Annabelle Lyon. Her new novel is one I devoured this summer at the cottage very quickly and then promptly started rereading it again. So without further ado, I will introduce you to today's author. Annabelle's short fiction has appeared in numerous publications, including Toronto Life, the Journey Prize Anthology, and Right Turns, New Directions in Canadian Fiction. She is also a frequent contributor to the Vancouver Sun and the Globe and Mail. Her first book of fiction, the short story collection Oxygen, which appeared in Porcupine's Quill back in 2000, was published to wide acclaim and was nominated for the Danuta Gleed and Relit Awards. Annabelle is also the author of a book of novellas, The Best Thing for You, and 2 juvenile novels, All Season Eddie and Encore Eddie. You're likely the most familiar with Annabelle's work, however, thanks to her best-selling novel, The Golden Mean, which won her the Rogers Writers Trust Fiction Prize. The Golden Mean was also shortlisted for the Scotiabank Giller Prize and the Governor General's Award. It has been translated into 14 languages. Now, she has written a smart, mysterious, and heartbreaking tale of sisterly devotion, resentment, and ultimately revenge. A story featuring two sets of sisters whose lives are braided together when tragedy changes them forever. Annabelle's writing in Consent has once again garnered the attention of the Scotiabank Giller Prize, landing her novel among 13 others on this prominent list of Canada's best. Consent is a startling, moving, thought-provoking story on the complexities of love, family, and how both can become entangled with guilt, resentment, and regret. Consent will hit bookstores on Tuesday. Please welcome Annabelle Lyon. Hi there.
Hi, how are you?
I'm so well. First of all, congratulations on the Giller nomination. How excited are you?
Thank you so much. Can I just add to your introduction? I use pronouns she and hers, and I'm coming to you from the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Mcqueen and the Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. And yeah, it's a huge privilege to be nominated alongside such a diverse and fabulous, I think, list of books. It was really exciting this year. And I feel honored. I feel really honored.
Especially during a time that people, I feel in 2020 have really been going back into reading as that primary hobby. So many people sequestered at home and just looking for a sense of escapism within. So that in itself must feel
yeah, go buy books, everybody. Go buy all of them, and go buy the ones that didn't make the list as well. You know what I mean? Like it's so easy just to shine that really tight spotlight on the books that make the lists, and then just outside the spotlight, there's this amazing array of other books that you know are totally worth everyone's time. So go buy books.
So just a couple of questions before we head into your reading, Annabelle. Speaking of it being 2020, the book is set in part in 2020. How did that resonate with you? I mean, obviously you would have written this a little while ago, and were you tempted to go back and change anything? Did that factor into the release and the publication coming up on Tuesday?
To my knowledge, it didn't factor into the publication date. I did go back and change a couple things. I think in earlier drafts, it actually ended in 2021. And we talked a bit, you know, because the book was finished well before the pandemic started. And, you know, we sort of talked about it with my editors, and you're like, that's going to be weird for people if it somehow goes into the future, but then doesn't acknowledge. So we did back the dates up a little bit. But this is a sort of alternate multiverse in which there's no COVID pandemic, because it was too much to try and shoehorn in at the last minute, you know?
Yeah. I was like, I have the advanced reader copy. So I was like, well, did that change or not? So, and I noticed on the Giller website, they had asked you what inspired you to write this book. And you said that you think of this book as a conversation between Crime and Punishment, The Diving Bell and the Butterfly, and Alexander McQueen's Savage Beauty. Can you elaborate on this for those who may not have read those books or aren't familiar with them?
Absolutely. So I'm going to save Crime and Punishment because that's the one everybody's probably most familiar with. Savage Beauty, Alexander McQueen is a fashion designer who sadly has died. There was a big retrospective of his work at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and this was the book that accompanied that retrospective. So it's mostly images of his clothes. I'm, as you can probably guess from the book, very interested in fashion design, and particularly haute couture, the really kind of high-end, you know, artistic kind of pushing the boundaries stuff. And McQueen is one of my all-time faves, so that's there. And then Diving Bell and the Butterfly by Jean-Dominique Bauby. Some of you might be familiar with. There was a movie of the same name made from the book. He suffered from. He was a French fashion magazine editor, actually, and had I think it was a stroke, and suffered from what was called locked-in syndrome, where he was completely, hadn't lost any of his mental faculties, was conscious, but couldn't move any part of his body. And the only way that he could communicate was blinking one eye. And he wrote a book. He wrote this little memoir. It's very slim, in that method. And so he wrote this book from locked-in syndrome, and there is going to be a character in Consent who's got locked-in, who is in the position of having locked-in syndrome. Mm-hmm. Crime and Punishment was the big one. So for those of you who need a really quick refresher, the crime from the title, there's this young student in St. Petersburg, Raskolnikov, who is very idealistic and also very poor. And he decides that for the good of all people around, he's going to murder this quite evil and nasty old moneylender, this old woman who's making everybody's lives miserable. And he sort of goes through this very fancy ethical, conversation with himself where he says, well, it's the greatest good for the greatest number of people, so I'm going to do this. But then, of course, when he goes to commit the crime, it gets messy right away, because it turns out the old woman lives with a sister who has a mental, I think they call her simple-minded in Dostoevsky, but she has a mental disability. And he has to kill her too, because she's a witness. And then, of course, suffers tremendous regret. And, the feature of Crime and Punishment that we all know really well is that he keeps going back again and again and again to the scene of the crime, and can't stop himself out of guilt. It becomes an obsession. And I thought, what if we were to tell that story from the point of view of the sisters? Evil old moneylender, what is that? What does that mean? And of course, if you're going to do that, you can't kill him off right at the start. So I had to keep him alive a little bit longer, and I had to sort of play with things a bit. But it's a sister, a wealthy woman who's got a sister who has a mental disability. And the Raskolnikov character, his name is Robert in my book, the R's, he becomes obsessed with them and comes back and begins to stalk them at a certain point, goes back again and again and again. And so really, that book was at the very outset of my thinking about this, about consent. That was way too long of an answer to your question, but it was really important to me.
Yeah, no, the Robert character is incredibly interesting throughout the story, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But right now I was wondering if you would do us the pleasure of sharing your love of haute couture and read a passage from Consent. I think you're gonna talk a little bit about the dress.
The dress.
Read about the dress.
Absolutely. So I don't think I need to preface this scene a whole bunch. Sarah, again, this is going to be the rich older sister. She's a university student. She's far more interested in vintage clothing than she is interested in her studies. She's discovered this vintage clothing store that she's obsessed with. And there's going to be a reference later on to a book which she kind of carries with her everywhere, and which is written by a French fashion editor, and is sort of becomes almost like a religious text for her. So I'm just going to jump right in. The bell above the door tinkled. There was a bell above the door. That was Simenon, stained glass at your knees, then 7 steps below the street, and a bell above the door. Silks and furs and dust in the wavering blue-green stained glass light. The assistants down there were mermaids, drifting green and lovely through the gloom. But their queen was the one Sarah feared and hoped for, a hag not 5 feet tall with the ugliest face, gaping, drooping mouth too wide and eyes like kelp bulbs. She was probably younger than she looked. The first time Sarah saw her, she assumed the woman was homeless. It took a closer look to notice her ripped black coat was comme des garçons, and there were pheasant feathers on her shoes. Her glasses, when she put them on to sit at the ormolu desk and handwrite a receipt, had spiked rims. She smelled of pepper and smoke, not a perfume in the conventional sense. Ne touchez pas, mademoiselle, she had said the first time Sarah visited the shop and reached for a price tag. Her eyes skimmed over Sarah, her demure September skirt and sweater. By October, the woman watched while Sarah fingered this and that, finger and thumb only, never overstaying. It helped that she wore the vintage wool peacoat she'd bought from one of the mermaids on her first visit to prove herself, or at least to prove the reach of her wallet. November had been a dung-colored silk scarf. When she returned the following week, the queen noticed she'd cut off the tassels. I didn't like them, Sarah said. Je ne les ai pas aimés. I do not know why we do not speak the one language or the other, the Queen said. I speak to you in English. You attempt French. Why? Sarah touched a silk blouse with one finger. That is too small for you, mademoiselle. She touched another. That one also. The Queen went away and came back with a hideous green and orange knit dress that would have cost Sarah a month's rent. This is for you, the Queen said. She was waiting on Sarah herself. That had never happened before. Sarah felt rather than saw the mermaids at the periphery of the store, behind the racks, hiding in the seaweed. The Queen walked into the change room with her and told her what to take off. She would not allow Sarah to handle the thing, but dressed her herself and fussed over the buttons. When Sarah reached to tug the fabric under one arm, the Queen practically slapped her hand away and fixed it herself. She smoothed the fabric over Sarah's hips and breasts with both hands, briskly, professionally, and stood back to examine her. Ce n'est pas mon goût, Sarah said. It's not my taste. The Queen led her from the change room to the shop, where she stood Sarah in front of the big mirror. The mermaids drifted over. The Queen murmured under her breath to one of them, who nodded. Sarah understood they were disparaging her shoes. Her eyes went to the rack the Queen kept behind her desk, where she kept her rarest pearls, a Poiret cocoon coat, a bias-cut gown from Madame Grès, a leather harness and leash from Vivienne Westwood, and something new, a black dress. What's that? Sarah asked. The Queen nodded at one of the mermaids, who retrieved the black dress and held it just out of Sarah's reach. She reached anyway, then let her arm fall. The Queen nodded and the mermaid came closer. Sarah reached again, but hesitated. That's a De Winter. The Queen flicked her chin and the mermaid returned the dress to the rack behind the desk. I've read about that dress, Sarah said. I've seen the photos. They returned to the change room, where the Queen supervised her undressing. I want to try it on, Sarah said. The Queen left her in the change room, bearing away the green and orange knit dress. Sarah stood for a long time in her underwear, waiting. When she finally came out, the Queen had rung up the hideous dress and was wrapping it in black tissue. Sarah wondered if this was the price of trying on the De Winter. It worked like that down here. The Queen read her mind and set her tests. 3 tests, the peacoat, the scarf, and now this thing. Sarah paid and took the now familiar Simenon bag. I want to try it on, she repeated, instead of saying goodbye. La Petite Rouge and La Petite Noire, that's what they were called in the spring of 1971. The designer was the legendary Paul Destry. The dresses came from one of his final collections. He was interested in the physics of clothing, planes and curves in motion. He had always been melancholic and disappointed in his own work. He refused all interviews, even after the dresses became famous, and subsequently abandoned fashion to dedicate his last years to mathematics. Shortly before his death, in 1974, in the Journal des Mathématiques Pures et Appliquées, he published an article on the configuration of ferns, a little-known precursor to Mandelbrot's 1980 articulation of fractal geometry. The red was the popular one. It was a boat neck shift, slightly asymmetrical and severely cut. The drop from shoulder to hem was sheer. And yet it flattered, oddly. According to Sarah's secret book, Saint Laurent himself was supposed to have bought one just to slit the seams and see where the curves were hidden. The red was rubies in blood. Women got married in it. Women wanted to be buried in it. The black was less popular. People found it harsh. The dress fell out of fashion abruptly in August of 1971 when the photographer Paul de Winter was arrested for the rape and murder of one of his models. They had just finished a shoot inspired by Persephone in the underworld. The model was 17 and didn't know the myth. She looked like a baby owl. De Winter berated her for being old and fat, then followed her home and ate pomegranate with his coffee for breakfast the next morning, the very pomegranate from the shoot, while her body cooled in the next room. He then photographed the corpse, the model's own petite noire pushed up to the waist, thumb bruises on the throat, There, Persephone in hell. The photos were shown at trial, and the dress got its name. French intellectuals claimed the photos as art. French women held chic parties to burn their De Winters. It was the 70s. 10 years later, the dress had a brief revival on the London punk scene for the shock value. Then it disappeared. Black was a child's idea of sophistication, the author wrote. An American's idea. The little black dress. Stupid. Coco Chanel was a peasant. For her mother's funeral, the author made a point of wearing white, like a Viet woman. It was a philosophical issue. The author approved of the Petit Rouge and wore hers even after the scandal. What had the dress done? She wanted to know. Nothing, that was what. Then, unsentimentally, she had sold the dress to a collector. Probably a fetishist, a pervert. He paid through the nose anyway. That was all right, Sarah thought. She had her inheritance. She, too, could pay through the nose.
And that she did.
She got the dress.
She got the dress eventually, and the storyline of the dress itself continues throughout the course of the book, and really has approached on your theme of revenge throughout this book. Why was resentment so important to include when you were approaching the story of sisters? I mean, the story surrounds two sets of sisters, the second being Saskia and Jenny, who are twins, and high fashion comes into play a lot in their storyline as well, and almost a little bit of revenge on that storyline when it comes to that haute couture.
It's funny, De Winter was actually my working title for the book for the longest time, but we decided that put too much focus on the one set of sisters, and they were both supposed to be of equal kind of weight through the story. But, you know, that was really an important part of it in the early writing. I mean, revenge, it's interesting. These are women in pain. So there's a similar dynamic with the two pairs of sisters, where we have a caregiver in each one, and we have someone in need of care. The other sister in each pairing is in need of care. And, you know, there are a lot of emotions that kind of swirl around that. The book's called Consent because obviously it touches on issues around sexual consent, but the more that I worked on it, it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. And it really, you know, I got a look at sort of consent in the context of caregiving, which was something that really interested me, and all that's wrapped up in that, you know, when you can't walk away from caregiving, or how hard that can be for women particularly, I think. And, you know, what is consent exactly if you think you're giving consent and then it turns out that maybe you didn't understand something entirely that you thought you were consenting to? You know, is consent always this big monolithic thing, or can it happen in a very small scale? You know, these were the things that really fascinated me. And of course, if someone feels that they've given consent and then there was a betrayal, or that they didn't give consent and something was done, of course, you're looking for justice, you're looking for retribution, you're looking for revenge, possibly. And so, you know, these things became this really tangled knot, all kind of tied up together, and so many emotions all tied up together as well.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've read a few of the reviews and talking about how the two stories are braided together, and it really is a little bit more like embroidery with chunks of knots, for sure. So I'm just wondering, like, you hit it right on the head when it comes to the sexual consent, especially in the book, saying, Sarah asking, do you ever wonder about consent when the two storylines cross, Sarah and Saskia both being the caregiver sisters in each story, and really looking, what does it say here? Sarah would ask and Saskia would repeat the things that she'd read about safe words and the psychology of the submissive. But Sarah would would, I don't want to give anything away. Sarah, I'm trying to skip over a little part here. Sarah would, and Saskia would just shrug, you know, like what her sister must have been thinking in that moment. And it's interesting how you touch on the psychology of the submissive. You talk about safe words, you talk about consent. And I'm curious, with the storyline being a little more vague, you don't hit it quite on the head with the second storyline. How was it writing back and forth between two generations of sisters when it came to talking about consent, about incorporating fetishisms or kinks within those storylines?
Well, that's such an interesting question. Yeah. So in one storyline, there's a bit of sort of a BDSM thing, which is a surprise, let's say, to some of the characters involved, and they're trying to sort of figure it out after the fact, figure out, you know, what was this? What happened? Was this really? Really? So yeah, and that's interesting. That generational question is interesting. I don't know that I very consciously thought I have to make this person's approach more old-fashioned, or I have to make these people younger and hipper. Like, I don't know that I was necessarily thinking in that way. I think that they were, I mean, I know that they were looking at consent from, you know, through different windows into the same room, in a way, if you will, because one of them was looking at consent in the context of BDSM, and the other one was looking at it in the context of this character with a mental disability. And you know, they're different, you know, connected but naughty, again, not naughty but knotty with the K, maybe a little naughty too, who knows. Yeah. But I mean, they're connected, but they were essentially different for me. And so really, I think the fact that they were both informed by those caregiving roles brought them closer together rather than kind of prizing them apart.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And there are a lot of parallels between the two stories in addition to this. And I wanted to touch on some of the other themes of consent that go through the book. I was just wondering at what juncture in your creative process that it hit you to braid the stories together, or if you went into writing the story knowing that they were going to come together at some point.
Absolutely not. No. So I first started working on this book way back in, it feels like Jurassic times now. In 2005, I published what ended up becoming chapter 2, which was called Maddie's Husband. And that's about I'm gonna spoil it because it's chapter 2, where the older rich sister, the moneylender character, she has to go away for work for a couple of days, comes back, and her younger sister, who has the mental disability but is fairly, you know, functioning, high functioning, has married someone without anybody else's knowledge or consent. And then Sarah has to deal with that and, you know, look at her capacity to consent and what does it mean to take away somebody's sort of agency and capacity. And I had written a sort of little fetal embryonic version of the novel with just those two characters, got to about 30,000 words, which is maybe 100 pages, and spent a lot of time talking with my editor about how do we blow this out and make it bigger? How do we make this into a full-on novel? And I kept resisting it because I thought, no, you know, this story for me is complete as it is. It doesn't need stuffing. And then I started playing with this other storyline, and I thought, okay, maybe a different way of making this into something bigger and shining light from more angles on what they're going through is to bring in another set of characters. And that became really fun because I decided that I wanted to, especially in the latter half of the book, go with a bit of a thriller structure. So it is a little bit of a revenge drama. It is a little bit of a sort of what just happened? Wait, what? And it was really, really fun building that in. And so it was a little tongue-in-cheek when I first introduced the Jenny Saskia storyline, because I thought, okay, thrillers, what do people do in thrillers? Twins, people in comas, you know, and I was sort of being a little bit self-parodying when I started. And then I thought, no, but you know what? I need to subvert this a bit. I need to make it match the emotional tone of Sarah and Maddie. So the more I got into it, the more it got serious. And so yeah, they were the latecomers, but by the end, I think they kind of rose up to have equal, I hope to have equal stature and equal weight in the novel.
Mm-hmm. I think that moment of what just happened had a lot more curse words when it happened when I was reading it. So
That was fun. That was fun to do.
lots of twists, and did not see a few different things coming, which was fantastic. And how you approach these intense narratives. I mean, throughout the storyline, going back to Robert and chapter 2 with the marriage, you write about mental illness with such inclusivity, respect, clarity. What was that process like of finding that storyline with Robert for you, and bringing him in that capacity to the storyline?
Well, I mean, it comes from a few different places. I've got characters who have mental disabilities as well as mental illness in here, and certainly in my own life, we all have people who have those things, and particularly with mental disability, I don't think they're really well represented in fiction or in pop culture, and I think it's good to bring them in a respectful and a dignified way and a realistic way.
Mm-hmm.
I guess the story does go way, way back. Again, it was around 2004. A lawyer acquaintance told me this anecdote about a young woman who, had gotten herself married without her family's consent, and then the family had to. And there it was a much simpler story because the guy was just a gold digger. He was looking to get to the family money, and they had to, take her before court and have the thing annulled because she couldn't give informed consent. And it was a very sad story,
Mm-hmm.
and that was kind of where it started for me. And then it kind of ran away from there. I thought I can tell that story, and I can complicate that story beyond that little thumbnail that I just gave you. It seemed to me that if we're going to respect characters with neurological difference, we have to say, okay, what does it mean? What does consent mean for them? What does it mean for us to respect consent there? So it's so complicated. It's so fraught. And I think this is the right time for this conversation too. Honestly, with everything that's kind of going on in the world.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. There's actually one part that you had posed a question where Sarah, the older sister, is asking of Maddie, who has the disabilities, is her boredom more genuine than Maddie's?
Mm-hmm.
And I thought it was really interesting because not just on the theme of consent, but really delving into those, as you said, neurological differences, and really presenting them in such an equal way. Just because she is differently abled doesn't mean her boredom means any less. So
Absolutely.
Beautiful. Yeah. So consent. It ended up being a good title because it's just there are so many themes of consent throughout both stories and throughout the book as a whole. And I wanted to touch on the alcohol theme.
Yeah.
In each story, you have an alcoholic, and each of them are women.
Mm-hmm.
What made you decide to make, and one is the mother,
Mm-hmm.
is the alcoholic, and then one is one of the caregivers. What made you choose to present that theme of alcoholism, as well as the shopping and the obsession with perfume and the obsession with art and high fashion, all of the various coping mechanisms that present themselves throughout the book? Was it important for you to include that?
Yeah, absolutely.
As females, particularly?
Absolutely. There really is only, well, there's 1.5, I guess, male characters in the book. There's Marcel as well, but it's mainly female characters that I wanted to look at and wanted to deal with. And, the image that kept coming back to me as I was working on this is that of shot silk. That's that kind of silk where it kind of looks different depending on which angle you look at it at, because the warp threads are one color and then the weft threads are another color. So it's like, it's blue. No, it's orange. No, it's blue. And I enjoyed playing with that. And so in the 2 pairings, I tried to have a lot of sort of, oh, here's the blue version, here's the orange version. I tried to have a lot of scenes where you think it's one thing, and then you read the next thing and you wait a minute, go back. That wasn't blue, that was orange. And with the caregiving, so I wanted that echo there. Of course, the mother of Jenny and Saskia is a caregiver herself. She's dealing with twins, and twins where one of them is neurodiverse, and it's a challenge, and she's coping as best she can, and that's not always very well. And then Sarah, on the other hand, also an alcoholic, adores high fashion, spends way too much on it, and really submerses herself in this world of kind of luxury and sensuality. And I do think these are addictions in both cases. They're coping mechanisms, they're escapes into her own intellect, because she sort of feels that that's her world, that takes her away from her sister, for better or for worse. Yeah, I mean, I was really interested in the ways that people cope. And the fashion one particularly, we tend to think of that as being a very female thing. We trivialize it in sort of pop culture and society. It's like, oh, she's a fashionista, she's a whatever. It's an art form, right? At its very, very best, it's an art form. It's sculptural, it's emotional, it's innovative, it's boundary pushing. You look at any, again, Mcqueen, I'll cite, or somebody like Iris van Herpen working today. These are amazing art forms, and I have lost the thread of where I was going with that. But oh yeah, coping mechanisms and the way that we use them to sort of enact a kind of misogyny, and trying to take them back in a gently feminist kind of way, and say, no, these are worthy things, and I don't care if you think they're female things, they're worthy things.
And there's a part also in the Saskia Jenny storyline after Jenny's accident, when Saskia is trying to take back control a little bit, and becomes, physically more like her twin sister, and has that appearance of being a fashionista, when in fact she's really just wearing her sister's clothes.
Well, that's the other aspect of clothing, which is so interesting, because we use it to project identities. We use it as armor, as costume. We use it to sort of tell a lie. I'm not feeling very confident today, so I'm going to wear my suit because that projects confidence. You know what I mean? And so she uses clothes in that way to really project something that she isn't.
Mm-hmm. And with I wanted to touch on the perfumes, because holy smokes. And I actually saw an alternate book jacket that has a bottle of perfume on it.
It's the American one, I think. Yeah.
And it's a gorgeous both of the book jackets are beautiful. But with the high fashion, with the French literature, with the perfume, there are moments where there are these sensory experiences. And it was so funny, because I was chatting with Aslan Hunter yesterday, who also went into a great detail about food and fine wine and whatnot in hers. And it reminded me of yours with the perfume and the very detailed descriptions of the scents and what they mean about you as a person. And I was curious how giving access to the characters' senses in that fashion enhanced the connection to the story for you while you were writing it, and also as the reader connecting back to that.
These are interests of mine, obviously. I don't wear a lot of perfume. I don't collect perfume, but it fascinates me. I love reading blogs about perfume. Somehow the way that it's translated into language is super fascinating to me. And of course, as a writer, if you enjoy language at all, it becomes a little bit of that kill your darling situation, where it's easy to indulge yourself with these lovely sensory, descriptions. And I found I had to pull back in many cases. I don't know, again, I feel as though it sort of speaks to that idea of addiction. It speaks to the idea of coping. It speaks to the idea of, trying to find something to kind of swamp your mind with, to take it away, to distract it from that other thing that is swamping your mind that you can't cope with in the moment. And so, as much as I love those things, as much as I love the sensuality and the beauty and the challenge of these art forms, perfume as an art form, I would definitely argue that, and fashion as an art form, they're also, I think for these characters, for Sarah in particular, it's a little bit of jazz hands too. She is trying so hard to deal with her own guilt, to deal with her own loneliness, to deal with all of these things.
Mhm. And with the and I wanted to touch on the perfume, not just because it does, you know, have that thread throughout the stories, but there are also points throughout each story where characters, one through perfume, are being deceptive, where
Mhm.
they're being manipulative, they're taking advantage of others, and these are all without consent. So I'm just wondering, when you were writing and delving into that overarching theme of consent, if you were purposely looking for that thematic connection between it, with that, with characters making presumptions, the wrapping
Yeah.
up purchases before the buyer has agreed to the sale,
Yeah.
and you know, doing things for another's own good by removing belongings or regifting a bottle of perfume that might be upsetting.
Mhm.
So I'm
Mhm.
just wondering how you approached weaving those in with the overarching consent.
Not all of them were conscious choices, honestly. And I think once you are dealing with these larger issues, you find it's one of those things where you look for it, you're going to find it. And I found that it started creeping in everywhere. And then if you start looking at your day and looking at the number of times in the course of a day that you're consenting or not consenting to things, or that consent's being misunderstood, it's endless and fascinating, and it's a much larger part. I mean, it transcends sexual consent. It transcends just consent with regard to caregiving. It's a huge piece of who we are as humans. I think that ability to say yes or to say no. It speaks to freedom. It speaks to agency. It speaks to all of those things. So I think that we are subconsciously making those, you know, consent decisions again and again and again all day long
Yeah.
throughout our lives.
We're gonna head over to the Q&A. I see a couple questions popping up. Just one last question, just hitting on
Sure.
that, just about the family bonds and why family bonds force us to be responsible for others without our consent. How did that play in with, I mean, we see in both of the storylines
Mm-hmm.
those caregiver roles, but it happens so automatically. There is no thought process to it happening. There is just this understanding that
Yeah.
we are now responsible, even though we haven't given consent to be responsible for those other people.
If you love someone, you want to do anything for them. And that sort of blurs over the fact that you are giving consent or not in that moment, right? Where if you say, of course, I'll take care of you, you know, I love you, you're my family. Well, you are consenting to something there. And I think it's interesting, again, the times when we kind of barrel forward with consent without even really thinking about the implications, which is what we do in families and what we do when there's love. And, you know, and that can get complicated. And I think that's exactly what happens with both of these pairs of sisters. It was born of love in both cases. The caregiving comes from a place of love, but then becomes so fraught and so difficult that the characters are forced to sort of take that hard look at themselves. And, you know, with that, I think comes a lot of guilt, sort of saying, am I a terrible person because I'm struggling with this? And I think that's something that we don't talk about. You know, it's much easier to say, yeah, I'll do anything for you. I'll change my life for you. Of course I'll take care of you. But to say, wait a minute, is this the best thing for me? Is this the best thing for you? That's a really hard conversation to have. And, you know, it was something that I wanted to kind of shine a light on.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. One of the attendees is asking us.
I'm sorry, I'm getting a really loud kind of shrieking sound in my mic,
Yeah,
in my earphones.
someone's sending me a text. It goes through my
Oh,
computer.
okay.
My apologies for that ding.
No, that's okay.
Whoever is texting.
That's okay. I didn't hear the question is the upshot.
Anonymous, let's see, attendee saying, does Annabelle have a sister or sisters?
I have family members. I don't especially want to sort of talk about this book in relation to them because I am protective of them. I know there's that old saw about, you know, never be born into the family of a writer or something like that, but I'm not that person. I don't really like to sort of put my family on display. So they're also not who I'm writing about particularly, I will say. I mean, anybody who, okay, I'm going to stop there. But no, I don't especially want to talk about my family.
Okay. And how did you come up with the distinguishing differences among all the characters in the novel? Did you develop their physical appearances along with their personalities, or did you develop those details separately?
an interesting question. Personalities come first for me, the characters, you know, psychological kind of states and who they are in the world and how they behave in the world and how they interact with other people. That's always the most important to me. I don't think there is a very good description of Sarah at any point, you know, in this book. The twins, I needed, for the purposes of the narrative, to have them be identical, but also have them present very differently. So one of them's really glam and, you know, sexy and cares about how she presents, and the other one wears like MEC rain jackets all the time and is much closer to my own little heart in terms of how I present in the world. Yeah, no, the physical stuff always comes later for me. I think that you have to determine the personality first.
And if you have more writing questions, Annabelle will be happy to answer them in her master's Writer Studio Masterclass, which is coming up soon. So we are going to have to wrap up. Just one quick comment from Leslie saying, quote, "I lost the thread of where I was going while talking about fabric and fashion." Great pun.
Oh, did I say that? I did not.
So
that's terrible.
Yeah, and then we also have a hello from Kate, who is joining from Nelson, BC. So
hello, Kate.
So much. I could go on, and I will continue to ask 1,000 questions after we wrap up. Absolutely adored this book and would recommend that folks go out and grab a copy. I really, really did it. Love this.
Can I say a big thank you to all of you who came out today, to Barbara, to Ara, to yourself, Tricia, and the sponsor for the event, whose name I'm sorry I've forgotten, but it's really been a privilege, and I'm so grateful to you all for putting this lovely thing together.
Well, it was our pleasure, Annabelle. I want to thank you and Tricia for a really compelling conversation. I mean, who doesn't want to read this book now? So much to it. The world of fashion, the world of perfume, taken apart like this in this really interesting way. A reminder then that all of Annabelle's books, but certainly this one, is available for purchase at Novel Idea here in Kingston. You can order it shipped to you, certainly also at your local independent bookseller. Thanks to Novel Idea, to Penguin Random House Canada, and thanks to you for joining us and for supporting Kingston Writers Fest. I hope you'll join us at 3:30 this afternoon, as I mentioned already, to listen to a great conversation about walking outdoors, featuring Norwegian author Torbjorn Eklund. So hope to see you there. Thanks so much, and bye for now.